He was uh, he was funny and interesting, and he was someone who seemed good to hang out with for several years, as it turned out to be. So suffice it to say, he sparked my curiosity, and my subsequent work began to focus on him more and more. In 2013, Robert Brown and I published a translation of Pius's Europa, which he wrote in 1458. That was a recent history of each region or country in Europe, with an emphasis on geography for about the first 2/3, and a lot of colorful anecdotes about local customs, events, and recent rulers. So in the process of working on that and working on the Europa, and trying to understand all of his many references, it got me thinking about why some details appeared in the Europa and others did not. And this opened a window for me onto his fascination with Europe and its peoples. But I still had many questions. I thought there was still a lot to explore there. And I wanted to understand where this obsession came from. So I decided to write the present book, From Christians to Europeans. And in addition to getting at his concept of Europe and the West, I wanted to bring more attention to Pius himself. As I note in the introduction to the book, Pius II is sadly not a household name. Renaissance popes have gained in popularity in recent decades. Some even have their own miniseries, but alas, such fame has eluded Pius. Even for scholars who work on the concept of Europe, Pius tends to get lost between Herodotus and the 18th century. So, that was one of the reasons I wanted to work on him and to focus on him in this regard. But more than this, I felt that there was so much that we didn't yet understand about him. And I wanted to write an intellectual biography with a focus on his concepts of identity. So, I hasten to say that I'm by no means the first scholar to argue for Pius's role as a key thinker on the concept of Europe. Many Renaissance scholars accept that Pius played an important part in this. Karl Enkel, for instance, recently called him the father of Europe. Isabella Walser-Bergler's recent book also stresses Pius's critical role in the early modern discourse of Europe. And the reasons for, this recognition, I should say the reasons are twofold. First, Pius wrote prolifically about the concept of Europe and its countries in a range of works, from letters and orations to his famous commentaries, his Germania, his history of Bohemia, and his Europa. Equally important, Pius's works circulated widely. And they circulated during his lifetime in numerous manuscripts, and shortly after his death in a number of early printings, including the massive Opera Omnia, printed twice in Basel in the 16th century. Hartmann Schedel also printed Pius's Europa as part of his 1494 Nuremberg Chronicle. So Pius, I think he would have been an important, a popular author regardless, but his elevation to the papacy gave his works exponentially broader reach and an air of authority. So this is, these are the main reasons, in my opinion, why he gets that kind of recognition as having such an important role in how Europe comes to be viewed. And that brings me to the purpose of this book. So, if it is broadly agreed that he is an important voice here, what more is there to say? And the question that brought me to this project is, how many people, even experts, understand how or why Aeneas took such a profound interest in Europe? And I wondered if a clearer sense of how he got to this point would help us better comprehend the modern concepts of Europe and the West as the most powerful identities that they've become, right? Would spending more time on a deeper exploration of this give us a better understanding not only of him, but the sort of layers that those concepts have taken on over time. So what I found in doing this research was that 3 experiences or moments in his life profoundly influenced this idea. First, his travels. Second, his classical education. And third, his reaction to the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. And it's a mix of personal firsthand experiences, shared educational culture, and a dramatic and violent external event whose echoes reverberated across Christian Europe. Fair enough, you might say, right? Isn't this all a bit obvious, right? We know what made Pius who he was, these important moments in his life. But what I think is important is the way they combine, and the timing and the shape of his reactions might surprise you, right? That they're not as straightforward as might seem. And each of these three areas needs to be sorted out in order to fully understand how they come together. And why it is that Pius and not another of his contemporaries came up with this idea, right? What made him so unique? So first, let's talk about his travels. His travels and his years living abroad. As I mentioned earlier, Pius served, or I'm going to go back and forth between Pius and Aeneas, so please forgive me. Aeneas, right? He's not Pius yet. Aeneas spent a decade as a secretary based in Switzerland from 1432 to 1444, pardon me, 1442. And he was there serving various high-ranking clergymen at the Council of Basel. And this work not only made him very familiar with Switzerland, but it brought him to France, the Netherlands, England, Scotland, and also Germany and Austria. The next decade, where he continued to work as a secretary, but now for the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III. This is between 1442 and 1455. Working for Frederick, he spent large amounts of time in Germany and Austria, and also traveled to Bohemia, Slovenia, and to Italy back and forth. So what's most interesting about this is that we actually get most of our information about these travels from his commentaries. And his commentaries were written a good 20 to 30 years later after all these experiences. So why is that, right? And what are we to make of that? Did he lack the time when he was younger? Would he have written about his travels regardless? Maybe. But what I argue in the book is that it was only after 1453, after the fall of Constantinople, that these ideas start to brew and take shape. So that triggers that response in many ways. And just to give you an example, the way that he speaks about Scotland. Aeneas visited Scotland in 1435 on a mission for one of the prelates he was serving. And at the time, he wrote very little about it. There's one letter that survives where he mentions being there, and he described it as being outside the world. That's pretty much it, right, so far as I've found. He says a little bit more about Scotland in 1458 when he writes the Europa, a few paragraphs on that. But he really goes to town in the commentaries, which he writes in the 1460s when he's Pope, and has a lot more to say about the people there, about colorful customs, about his own experience there in ways that really need to be unpacked. The same thing happens in the way that he talks about Germany, or doesn't talk about Germany at first. Regarding Germany when he's living there, right? There are a few scattered comments on German life and culture. He has one early letter on Vienna, but until 1457, 1458, when he writes the Germania, he doesn't really have a whole lot to say. So what I've argued is that at the time he was living abroad and he was doing all this traveling, he doesn't seem to have registered very big differences between Northern Europeans and Italians like himself, right? We don't know what to make of that. Is it just that he didn't think it was worth mentioning? Is it that he didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it? He hadn't processed it. He hadn't internalized it. He didn't think the recipients of his letters would be interested in it. But, it's important to note, why is it that he has so little to say at the time and so much later? So for this reason, the book, as I organized it, eschews the typical biographical structure, which would usually spend several chapters on his early life, his education in Siena, his life at the Council of Basel, his decade serving the Holy Roman Emperor, all very important developments that predate 1453. But despite the many travels he had undertaken by this time, as I say, he writes very little about these places. So I condensed that into one chapter. given that my emphasis is on his writings on Europe and the West. And these experiences, they're definitely worth noting. They're worth thinking about and thinking about them in chronological order. But, because these experiences gave him fodder for later writings, to be sure. But the other thing that I argue is that many of these writings, right, these later writings, they not only come from a later time, they come from a later point of view. So I reject the notion that a lot of biographers have worked with, where they try to use the commentaries to envision young Aeneas, right, sort of striding through these areas, and what he saw, what he felt. I think that what you see in the commentaries is a different person talking and maybe inventing some of what he wants us to believe about those moments. So those are the travels. Second point that I mentioned, 1453 was a very critical moment for Aeneas, a turning point in many ways. And before the fall of Constantinople, Aeneas was not a huge crusade advocate. A lot of people imagine that he just always cared deeply about crusade, but this is not the case. If you look at his earlier letters and tracts and such, he at times was skeptical or outright hostile regarding crusade. He saw it as a tool for the papacy against the council that he was serving. So he worried that this was just another form of papal overreach. He also criticized crusade when it was, particularly the Crusade of Varna, which was being led by the King of Poland and Hungary, Vladislav. And he did this because he was at the time serving the Holy Roman Emperor, and he felt that Vladislav was competing with Frederick, right? That he was, basically was going against Frederick's own claims to territory, to rights in Eastern Europe. So that's worth noting, right? He doesn't start off as a huge crusade advocate. There was some softening over time about this. He starts to become a little more interested in it later on, but it's really only in 1453 that you see this abrupt change, that you see this full-on embrace of crusade. So that year, of course, saw the capture of Constantinople by an Ottoman army led by the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II. The city fell on May 29th. And news of this was received with shock and dismay in Western Europe. Aeneas heard about it in late July from his perch in Graz in Austria, where he was serving Frederick. And as I've shown in Creating East and West, along with other scholars like Robert Schwabel, Margaret Meserve, and James Hankins, humanists were especially affected. Perhaps none, I argue, more than Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini at this time. He was moved by the loss of life and the enslavement of the population, but he was also deeply upset by the dispersal of scholars and reports of the loss of thousands of books. And in one famous letter, he described the conquest in dire terms, the sack that followed, of course, in dire terms for learning and culture, predicting that it was, quote, a second death for Homer and a second loss for Plato, unquote. And in the book, my most recent book, I explore at length the traumatic impact that 1453 made on Aeneas, right? I think in previous works, I'd thought more about his sort of intellectual reckoning with it. But as I explored his letters and read through the letters from mid-1453 to early 1454, they told a story that, I thought was fascinating. Over 80 of his personal letters over 80 of his personal letters written within a year of news of the conquest reaching him touch on or deal extensively with the subject. And this number of over 80 letters in which he talks about this in some context is nearly half of his surviving correspondence. So that's pretty significant, right? It shows that he was deeply concerned, one might say obsessed with this, that it occupied a lot of his time, his thinking, his bandwidth, and his conversations with other people. The subject, as you can read about it in his letters, made him by turns frightened, angry, physically ill, hopeful for a joint response, and desperate to help by means of his letters and orations. at 3 imperial diets at which he spoke. So he attended 3 imperial diets. Frederick, interestingly enough, attended only 1. So you can imagine poor Aeneas being there on his own, trying to rouse members of the Holy Roman Empire to join a crusade, right? To engage in defense of Christendom and other terms he uses. He does start talking about Europe at this point as well. And but the letters in particular really give us insight into his psyche at this time in ways that other scholars haven't really explored. So I think they deserve a lot of attention. Another reason why 1453 is important, I argue, is that the Ottoman advance really seems to propel Aeneas to greater fame and eventually the papacy. It gives him purpose, and increasingly it gives him standing, right? He starts to appear as an authority on the Ottoman Empire, on crusade, on the geopolitical situation in Europe and different areas. And, we can see this again by looking at his letters, because his letters prior to the fall of Constantinople show that he very much felt himself stalled in his career and frustrated, right? He writes to his cousin some plaintive letters saying, everyone's forgotten me. A year prior to that, he was in Italy with Frederick, where Frederick met his bride. They, processed through the peninsula all the way down to Naples and back for this magnificent wedding. And Aeneas gave an oration to Pope Nicholas in Rome, stopped in Venice. And many people were saying, oh, you're going to be cardinal next, right? Your star's on the rise. 1453, he's back in Graz, right? He's cooling his heels and wondering, when is anything going to happen for him? So this, as I said, I think he hooks his star to this subject, to this cause in many ways. But you could also argue that this cause moved him, right? That it's almost as if he writes of it as if he feels he has no choice, right? He just responds to it so deeply. So in his letters and orations from 1453 and following, you see more uses of the terms Europe and West. And you see them being used in some creative new ways, especially in his appeals to Christian leaders to organize a response. He starts to think about what is at stake, what needs to be protected, and how to bring people together. And you get a sense that clearly for him, speaking of Christendom alone was no longer enough. And, perhaps one of the reasons he does this is the appeal of speaking of Europe, or the appeal of speaking of the West, is that you're talking about a region without a natural leader, right? Neither the Pope nor the Emperor clearly have a claim on Europe in the same way that Christendom, the Holy Roman Empire, what those terms evoke. So that might have been part of his calculation at this time. So the book explores how he starts to think more carefully about borders, and how he argues also at the same time, right off the bat, in some of his earliest letters about the fall of Constantinople, that the Ottomans are not European, right? And that's really important, that he's adamant about that they don't belong there. They're like these temporary interlopers. And this is all despite them being present in the continent for over a century, being well established, not just as conquerors, but as allies, and diplomats, and so forth. So, but Aeneas is pretty consistent with this message about them not belonging. And one of the things I argue in the book is that in many ways, it seems as if Aeneas created a concept of Europe in order to exclude the Ottomans from it. And I also argue that had 1453 not happened, Europe, as Aeneas conceived it, wouldn't really have taken shape in the same way for him, right? That the two are entwined, and we need to think about that, right? When we imagine this concept taking shape for him. So far we've discussed his travels, we've discussed the impact of 1453 on him. And finally, the third piece that I want to look at is, and the book addresses, is the impact that the classics had on him in helping to provide some of the tools and the framework for Aeneas's rich rhetoric about Europe and her nations. So, to an extent, this is a shared discourse among humanists, especially regarding the Ottomans, as I've explored in my other works. So, some of this is, these are ideas that he has grown up with, that he's been using for some time. And there's nothing that unusual about that, right? Other humanists kind of, respond to the fall of Constantinople with somewhat similar terms. But there is something unique in Aeneas's approach that I tease out in the book. There's a moment that we can actually put our finger on that I think is really transformational for him, and that I explore. So one of the biggest influences on him actually happened a few years after 1453. In 1455, Aeneas was sent by Emperor Frederick to Rome to congratulate the new Pope, Calixtus III, on his elevation to office. And Aeneas went there, made an oration. He never went back to Germany after this point. I think was very happy to be back in Italy, found many reasons to stay. And he spent time at the papal court, going on missions for the Pope and such. But another thing that happened to him while he was at Rome is that it was there that he found Tacitus's Germania, which had been recently rediscovered. And I argue that this piece of ancient ethnography, with its evocations of Germanic culture, society, political structure, values, even personality, was another turning point for Aeneas. Tacitus's Germania plus Aeneas's likely greater access to Strabo and Ptolemy, also in Rome, plus Aeneas's concerns about the Ottomans and his new interest in borders and this whole sense of us versus them, all these things lit a match to a period of incredible authorial productivity, right? So everything now comes into laser focus for him. And we see this starting in late 1457, early 1458, when Aeneas composed his own updated Germania, right? His own text talking about this region, in which he attempts to capture the vast area, the beauty and productivity of its cities and countryside, the character of its rulers and people, and many of their customs. It's a celebration of modern Germany. Interestingly, written in part because the Germans were not very happy with Rome at this particular time. There had been many accusations that the papacy, their tides had gotten out of control, that they weren't giving enough control to the Germans to appoint their own officials to important offices. And they'd been attacking the papacy for overreach. So Aeneas, in writing this, part of the message, which he says pretty bluntly, is that the Germans have nothing to complain about, right? They're wealthy, they're prosperous, they're doing great. So, arguably it shows how far the Germans have come with centuries of Roman influence. And it's fun to read this in tandem with Tacitus's Germania, because it's almost like an answer to Tacitus, where Tacitus talks about, the Germans have a lot of virtues, a lot of good things going for them, and they're brave and they have great customs regarding marriage and so forth. But, they're lazy. They have problems being on time. They don't do enough agriculture, you name it, right? I mean, all problematic assumptions, but it's as if Aeneas is saying, well, look at where they are now, right? Look how far they've come. And in some ways it seems to be, he seems to be saying they've surpassed the Romans, right? The modern Romans, the Italians. They have very clean cities, right? For instance, and just that they are kind of the height of modernity, as it were. Now, this work, both the Tacitus's Germania and then Aeneas's own work, the Germania, they seem to have opened the floodgates for Aeneas. It got him very excited to think about concepts of national identity and European identity and character. And I'm sure being in Rome and being close to the Pope and the Curia for an extended period likely also affected his views. But shortly after composing the Germania, Aeneas wrote another massive work, the Europa, which I mentioned, in early 1458. Then he wrote the History of Bohemia later that year, Interestingly, both those two works were written when he was laid up with the gout. So, despite the suffering that he experienced from his illness, it seemed like he tried to make good use of the time. And he worked very quickly from the sound of it. He also drafted an unfinished history of Austria for several years. So he was thinking along those lines as well. And with all of these things, we see him crafting ideas about national and European identity at the same time. They go hand in hand for him. But, again, I want to note how different these pronouncements are from his earlier thinking. So, for instance, in 1446, he composed a treatise called De Ortu about the origins and authority of the Roman Empire, specifically looking at the Holy Roman Empire, trying to legitimate their place as he's serving the Holy Roman Emperor. But in this work, he talks about empire, right? He keeps referring to it as empire, empire, empire. And then when you look at what he's writing in 1458, he's talking about Germans, right? He's also talking more about Europeans. And he talks about Bohemians, the French, the English, etc., right? So he's really starting to think of them in these terms. He has a tougher time essentializing Italians, which is always the case. Having come from that area, he's less inclined to make these kinds of generalizations about his own region. But you get the picture, right? That he is eager to form these categories about other peoples and to try to create this sense of understanding, this sense of kind of control, as it were. And he also starts conflating peoples with their lands, right? He writes a kind of land-based history, as Monte Carlo has argued. And it's a very important moment, right? That a shift from the type of history writing where, you have a long tradition of chroniclers writing these world histories or, lengthy histories of dynasties and such, maybe a history of a city, as with Bruni. But this is one of the earliest attempts to try and talk about the history of a region, right? The history of a country and not just, a dynasty. This doesn't mean that Aeneas was a rigid nationalist. In fact, one of the things I argue in the book is that he saw a lot of change and fluidity in these areas, right? So he would not have lined up with some modern nationalist concepts in a lot of ways, but he arguably paved the way for that thinking. Now, of course, during his papacy, Pius would expand on many of these ideas of European and national identity in his orations, like that of Mantua, which was the Congress that he called in 1459 to try and summon a crusade. So this was his opportunity to speak to a large crowd that was gathered there and to exhort them to go on crusade. In this fascinating oration, he talked up the many good qualities of Western European peoples, manliness being one of them. There are a lot of fascinating gendered assumptions about Western Europeans, right? They're the manliest of men. Greeks, unfortunately, get the short end of the stick on that one. A lot of complicated assumptions about other peoples as well. But he's definitely associating Western Europeans with this sense of kind of manliness and courage. But even more interesting than that in some ways is what he has to say about Europe versus other parts of, larger Christendom. A quote that, just fascinates me from the Congress of Mantua, from his oration, is, "Let all of Asia and Africa pass away, and let us look only to Europe and take account of the present," end quote. Right? This is amazing coming from a pope. It's a far cry from earlier popes speaking about Christendom, speaking about brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, right? He really seems to be focused on defending their borders. So, and of course, also in his papacy, he composed the commentaries, and they are fascinating as well. A third-person, self-flattering autobiography that contains many references to places that he visited, customs and characters of the people of different regions. Many of these places he didn't visit, but just based on the information he gathered about them. It's so rich when you think about concepts of identity. A lot more can be done with the commentaries. They didn't circulate in his lifetime or even close to that, but later on would get a bigger audience. So, but again, as I noted earlier, the commentaries contain passages that were the product of a mature mind looking back, not a young secretary in his 20s, right? So that's an important distinction. So let me wrap this up with a few words on Pius's impact. A dedicated study on Pius's readership has yet to be done, but I think it's reasonable to posit that he had a strong impact on the discourse of European identity for two reasons. First is the spread of his works. Pius was one of, if not the most widely read humanist for centuries after the Renaissance, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. It's like he had a megaphone, right? So there's that. He was prolific when it came to writing about Europe. It's also important to note the timing. J.R. Hale sees a rise in the use of the term Europe and a sense of European culture, Europeanness as an identity in the early 16th century. And I think Pius was instrumental in this. I think he played a role, perhaps indirectly, if not directly, but his timing was very good. He wrote these works right before the age of exploration and colonialism, at a time when a lot of improvements were being made in geography, when people were becoming more and more interested in mapping the world. And his concept of Europe was not neutral, right? It was very, self-congratulatory, and it finds its way into a lot of these movements, right, in some arguably devastating ways. So, but whether or not Pius had a direct or indirect impact, I argue that Pius is good to think with when you are trying to reckon with notions of Europe in this period, because of how much he wrote about it. He really captures this moment for us, gives us a sense of how he and a lot of his contemporaries were thinking. So in conclusion, just a few last thoughts. Other scholars like Bartlett and Le Goff have shown how Europe was made in the Middle Ages, right? That it really started to cohere as a society in a lot of ways. But what Pius contributes, I believe, is an awareness of a common European culture, right? That's something you don't see before. He really gets the ball rolling on that, right? He articulates it. He gives people a language, and as I've said, at times describes a kind of personality to Europe and to Europeanness that is different. And so that's one important point. Another, of course, is when we think about the inheritance that Pius left behind, it's a divided inheritance on what it means to be European or quote unquote Western. My book tends to focus on the more negative aspects, the othering, the chauvinism, and I think it's crucial for us to remember how they come about, the context of Pius's time, the defensiveness, the fear, the xenophobia, without defending all of the lengths that he went to in doing this, it is important to remember that the Ottomans were a serious military threat, right? The very confidence that Pius projects is rhetorical in nature, and it's aspirational, right? It's a call to unite. It's a call to close borders. But within decades, that spirit would be transferred to aggressive expansion. And all the superiority that he boasted of with very little ground, unfortunately, starts to be weaponized, in my view, right? I think that there are connections there that are, always worth sorting out. And for many years, Pius was dismissed as ineffective because his crusade never took off, right? He dies at the port of Ancona. But I argue that in some ways he succeeded in his dream to, quote, expel the Turks from Europe. That is a phrase he used frequently, right? He believed or wanted to believe that one could expel them. And it's a phrase he might have gotten from Hungarians as well. It seems that that was something that they were fond of, and I think he may have picked up on that as well. But he may have succeeded in that by convincing generations of thinkers that the Ottomans were interlopers from the East, that they were not a real part of Europe. And it's only in the last few decades that scholars have been revealing just how embedded Ottoman culture, learning, art, and material goods were in the European Renaissance. Pius wanted to erase those connections. And arguably, he succeeded for a long time in establishing that heavy bias, right? If you look at 19th century, accounts of the Renaissance, early 20th century accounts, you don't see a lot about the Ottomans, right? So I do raise that as something to ponder. But to end on a perhaps lighter note, there is also a positive story here. Pius articulated a concept, a European concept of self and community that foreshadowed aspects of the European Union, a sense of common purpose, unity, bonds of mutual protection and non-aggression among neighbors. And given the threats to sovereignty of European states today, his rhetoric truly hits home. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for this engaging and enlightening talk about the role of Pius II's thinking, particularly in writing and creating that kind of European identity as we're talking in the Renaissance. So by now the Q&A section is open. If you have any questions, I'm happy to read them to Professor Bisaha while we still have her. But if you don't mind, I'm going to start with my own questions. In the meantime, our audience can come up with their own questions. So my first question is about Pius II responses to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In what ways do you think that his responses to this historical event reflect broader Renaissance anxieties about boundaries between Christendom, Islamic world, Europe, the East, these kinds of concepts?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think his response and the response of some of his other contemporaries too, it's easy to understand why they were anxious, as I said, right? This was perceived as a military threat, that the loss of this city was just astonishing to them, right? That everything it had represented. But one of the things I try to point out in the book is that there are many responses to the Ottoman conquest, what he represents in his rhetoric is one train of thought, right? One type of discourse that appeals to many people, but is not by any means the entirety of how contemporaries were viewing the Ottomans, right? Many others were very interested in establishing greater bonds with the Ottomans, and certainly didn't buy into the rhetoric of them being barbarians, right? That's one of the catchphrases that Pius and others use, right? That's something, unfortunately, the more I looked at his rhetoric, he's kind of unwavering about that. There are times where he hints that they may have had more complexity than that, but I think he dissimulates, right, about things he knew to be true about the Ottoman Empire, right? He really tries to create this stark picture that many of his contemporaries didn't agree with.
Right. This is really important, and so my personal exposure to your scholarship was, of course, with Creating East and West. That was, I believe, 2004. Correct? Is that the year? Yes. So from that book, which offered a foundational study of Renaissance humanists' perceptions of the Ottoman world, the Ottoman Turks, and their role in shaping early modern notions of the East and West. So how did your thinking and research trajectory from that book evolve into this book in 2023?
Yeah, so the way that it evolved, I guess, as I mentioned, I found Pius to be just such a fascinating figure. And I treated him among 30 other humanists in the first book and wanted to do a deeper dive. I just wanted to understand more about the thinking of one individual and to see, what more I could learn from that. So, Pius he's a very rich subject to study. He's in a lot of ways an easy subject to study for people who don't have the ability to go and spend months or years in the archives, because so much great work has been done editing his texts. So, and we have a lot of that just to continue to pore over. But yeah, I think, some of the things that have shifted, for instance, I had a view of his letter to Mehmet that I thought was, never sincere, in the sense that, I thought it was always kind of, this attempt to gain the upper hand with Christian princes, or, it was a rhetorical device in a number of ways. And of course, the fact that it wasn't sent, is one reason to think that. But as I looked at it again and really started to think about that in the context of his other works, and the timing of it, I reached another conclusion about it, which is that I think there are two voices in the letter. I think that it's very possible he began it with the idea that maybe he could reach out to the Sultan, maybe he could, form common bonds with him and peacefully, right, appeal to him. But then I think his other tendencies take over, right, as he continues to write it. And I argue that it evolves into something that he knew he couldn't send, right? But I think it's important to note that maybe, there was a part of him that wanted to do that. And granted, he never really seems to have seen Mehmet as an equal, right? There's definitely that paternalistic quality to it. One of the things that I find kind of shocking in his work is that he never seems to admit that that Mehmet was a learned individual, that he himself was a scholar, and that he, had this very sophisticated court, and he was a patron. His other contemporaries whose work he used were talking about that, and he wouldn't, right? He just wouldn't admit that.
Right. It's really fascinating. So we have two questions in the Q&A box. One by Elizabeth, who asks, "Can you please say more about Hungarian anti-Turkish rhetoric?"
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew more about it, but I would say I think it's a subject that's worth exploring. I've seen that use as early as the 13th century with King Bela, talking about the Mongols, and talking about Europe in that regard. So I think that that is something that Aeneas might have picked up on from them, right? Picked up on, and certainly in John Hunyadi, I think in his speech or his correspondence, there's a sense that he also talked about Hungary as the bulwark of Europe, right? As defending Europe. That I think is also really important, that to acknowledge that Aeneas didn't necessarily come up with all these ideas completely on his own, right? That he might have been responding to what other contemporaries were saying.
Right. Thank you. And the second question is, was Pius II mentioned in 1480 in response to the invasion of Otranto?
That I don't know. That's a really good question. I haven't, done a deep dive on Otranto in a long time. So, but I'd love to find out if that's true. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And the next question is by Liz. Thanks for the interesting talk. I second that. I still sometimes attend museum special exhibitions, for example, that frame Ottomans as the other and as not part of Europe, which seems to be an aspect of Pius II's legacy. Is there a specific way that you would suggest pushing back on this type of framing using Pius II?
I think the only way you can do it by using Pius II is to really be deliberate about his context, right? And to say that, so for instance, I mean, I'm really struck by how similar language about Europe and about the West and about sort of defending borders is invoked against immigrants and refugees. And and it's just a world of difference from what Pius was writing about, right? Pius was talking about a heavily militarized empire. So, and to sort of lift that rhetoric and then to juxtapose it, or to apply it whole to other contexts, I think is really dangerous, right? That's something that just is definitely worth being aware of and calling attention to. One of the things that I talked about, I think I think whether or not we think he's the father of Europe, he's arguably the father of Eurocentrism, right? And this idea that Europe is really special, Europe sets the standard, right? That I think that's a big part of what he does in his work, that he sort of gets that ball rolling. But yeah, using Pius's work is a good question. I mean, I think I would just draw more attention to the kinds of wonderful exhibits and and studies that are being done about the Ottoman Empire, right? And to show that you can't really talk about you have Ottoman Europe, right? That was part and parcel of Europe. And okay, so I do have one answer. One way you could use Pius's work to respond to that is that despite the negative mantra that you often see in his works, he spends so much time talking about the Ottomans that kind of inadvertently he proves that they were part of Europe, right? That they were, he cannot talk about Europe without talking about the Ottomans. He cannot talk about Eastern and Central European powers without bringing them into it, because they were embedded. They were, using the same tactics. They were, diplomatically linked, and and they were allies and trading partners. So that would be one way to use Pius, is to say, despite the message he's trying to say with one side of his mouth, he is talking on and on and on about the Ottomans because they were there, because he knew they were important and they were central.
Interesting. So the next question is, thank you so much for this. I'm curious if you have a sense of this idea about the physical component of going on crusade after so much time theorizing, preparation, fears of violence, etc.
I'm sorry. Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, I'm curious if you have a sense of his ideas about the physical component of going on crusade after so much time theorizing, preparation, fears of violence, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in his rhetoric, his orations, for instance, he, like I said, the way that he tries to promote the sense of masculinity seems to be, speaking to a very martial theme, that he, I don't know if he, addresses it in quite that way. He does talk about it a little bit in the letter to Mehmed, and he does talk about it in one of his orations, the oration of Wiener Neustadt, where there are a couple moments where he seems to show some concern about warfare, and also too warfare in the name of religion, right? That I think he talks about, for instance, in Wiener Neustadt, if Christian soldiers win the upper hand, they shouldn't pursue the enemy too hard, right? They should be merciful, and also too, in the letter to Mehmed, one of the reasons he says that he's writing it is that too much blood has been shed, right? And this would be, of course, Mehmed would have to convert, right? Mehmed would have to come over to his side, but it seems to be an admission that that he would prefer a more peaceful solution.
Great. So we just to note that we have 7 more minutes, and we still have a couple of more questions, even though I have provided your email in the chat. So if there are further questions, they can contact you directly. I'm also happy to forward your questions to Professor Bisaha. So the next question is by Elizabeth Fama. You mentioned in passing that Pius II could be funny. Was it just an occasional lightness in his writing? Not to put you on the spot, but do you have an example of his humor off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I mean, I would say it just comes out in a lot of self-deprecating ways, which is part of why, I find him kind of charming, and I know that he has, some of his rhetoric is very harsh, but when he's speaking in a more friendly manner, among his associates and such, that makes him very human. There are letters, for instance, where he's approaching middle age, and that's when he finally decides to join the priesthood. And he says, well, I'm starting to lose my hair, and everything in my teeth, and so I might as well do this now. He's just, just a very kind of sweet sense of himself, of trying to embrace the changes that life brings.
Okay. The next question is by Edward. Many thanks for a beautifully clear presentation on my favorite pope. I can't remember now whether Pius talks specifically about Islam, and does he refer to Saint Francis's meeting with the Sultan?
I'm not aware of him talking about Francis. That is a great question, because that would be a really useful link to make. Um, yeah, and I mean, one of the reasons that I for a long time was skeptical about whether the letter to Sultan Mehmed was genuine, in the sense of a genuine outreach, is that I think there were a lot of good antecedents, and there were several contemporaries who were thinking very seriously about that type of outreach that he could have invoked, he could have worked with, and he didn't. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons that the letter of Mehmet is so tricky, is just the way he caricatures Islam at times. He's drawing on the Quebratio, not the Quebratio, he's drawing on the tract by Wanda Torquemada, which is really polemical about Islam.
Okay. The next question is by Emma, my very good colleague at MAP. You mentioned Pius' evocation of classical texts. Have you found any responses in Pius's rhetoric about the Ottomans and the call for the crusade with the histories of the early crusades in the 12th, 13th centuries?
Hmm. Um, Trying to think. I know. I mean, he does talk a little bit about it. I think he mentions a little bit about early Crusaders in his work, The Asia. Uh, you know, there are a few references, right, to that. But he also just does a lot with, like, Julius Caesar, for instance, right? And in the oration at Mantua, he tries to frame the Crusaders as occupying this kind of Roman model, right, of masculinity, and so yeah, so he does on occasion touch on that. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Elizabeth Griffith follows up. Did he talk about the Reconquista in Spain, ended in 1492?
Uh, does he talk about that? Um, he has a couple of references in the Europa. Trying to remember if he mentions it at all in the commentaries. He doesn't get into it as much as you would think. That's what I can say is I fully expected he would pay more attention to that, and I just wonder if that's because the idea of a reconquista is something that is more of a later notion in some ways, right? That it's kind of like the Renaissance is a later invented idea. Is that part of it? Is that
Mhm.
contemporaries didn't see it as this fully formed kind of thing?
Mhm.
I could be wrong, but he doesn't talk a lot about it.
Wonderful. We only have 2 more minutes. Next question. Could you speak a bit more about the influence of Germanic and especially Europa in 16th century? Did it differ in different cultures, countries? Was it more influential in North Europe than Italy?
The Germania, his work. Oh yeah, yeah, it does get taken up. I think it becomes pretty popular in Northern Europe, and it also just attracts more attention to Tacitus. But yeah, I think it takes on a life of its own in some interesting ways, and it helps to, I think, kind of give more steam to the kind of proto-nationalist movement in Germany, right? That idea of kind of pushing back on this idea of the uncouth German, the barbarian German. Yeah, but it is definitely, it gets circulated in Northern Europe.
Wonderful. The next question is by Barry. Is there any recognition in Pius's words regarding the intellectual complexity of the Ottomans as an other or an enemy? This is specifically after things like the fall of Constantinople, the collapse of learning in the East, or did he make room for the Ottoman Empire to have the intellectual complexity that he pines in is collapsing?
I don't see it. And I could, I'm happy to be proven wrong on this, but there are a couple of places where, as I said, one of the things that really astonished me is that, even though he's using Nicholas Secundino's work, for instance, and he talked about how, Mehmed spent his time and, the kind of reading that he did, the kind of scholars he had with him. Pius does not mention that, right? He doesn't, he just, and I think part of it is he was so shocked by reports of the loss of thousands of books that he had this ingrained notion in his mind that that the Ottomans were anti-culture. Either that, or he just did not rhetorically like that idea of trying to project that kind of complexity. And it's different from other contemporaries, right? There are Byzantine refugees who are writing about the Ottomans with a lot more nuance than Pius, and I think they had a greater awareness and they didn't reduce them in that way. But there are occasions where he talks about he uses terms like gens to refer to the Turks, whereas he for like a race, kind of like, which to me sort of speaks of like a disorganized group of people, as opposed to natio for others, populace for others, that which seem to kind of connote a more organized state, a legitimate state. On occasion, he'll use something like regnum or imperium. But he doesn't, I would say he tends to punch down, right? He tends to, not want to give them, a sense of complexity. And I think he's pretty consistent about his own rhetorical goals.
Great. We have run out of time, but last two questions. Elizabeth follows up. Sounds like his dumping on Greeks for being unmanny is straight from 1204 then.
Perhaps. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into that, that might well be part of it. And it's interesting too, the way that he goes after the Greeks, he doesn't do that immediately. He's very sympathetic to the Greeks after the fall of Constantinople, and it's only a little bit later that he starts to show a little bit of an anti-Greek bias. And it comes out after he goes to Rome, for instance, and it's as if he's looking for someone to blame, or a way to boost up his Western European audience, is to say that, well, this won't happen to us, right? Because we're good fighters. It's just, but yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things there. There are probably some classical stereotypes that he's weaving in as well.
Great. And the last question is by the same person, who asked about the influence of Europa in the 16th century. How about the influence in 16th century Italy and Northern Europe?
Well, I mean, the Europa it gets, as I said, printed several times. It's translated into Italian. It's translated into German. So, it was just kind of a groundbreaking work in a lot of ways that they really, it was just a fairly recent history. It was, basically from roughly, 1400 to 1458. And, sometimes it goes back a little bit further in time, but it got, pretty considerable circulation. And I think that it helps to kind of point the way toward a different type of writing of history.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your patience in answering all of our questions, which were so many. I also encourage our audience, if they have any follow-up questions, to contact Professor Bisaha directly or send your questions to me. Please join us next week for our second talk of this new series by Professor Megan Moran, Gender and Family Networks in Early Modern Italy. Same link will work for every week, so you don't have to look for a new link. Just click on the button and the invitation email, and then you'll join the session. Thank you so much again, Professor Bisaha, for joining us today and being the wonderful first speaker of this new series. Hope to see you again in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And please do feel free to email me. I'd be very happy to hear from you. All right. Take care.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.